Hello and welcome to the Week in Politics with Michelle Grattan. I'm Caroline Fisher, Associate Professor of Journalism at the University of Canberra. Michelle, hi, how are you?
Hi, Caroline.
What a crazy week.
Absolutely.
So the focus has really been on the cost of living and national security this week, and both of the issues seem to be causing trouble for the government in particular. Let's start with the cost of living. So yesterday, the Australian Bureau of Statistics revealed a sharp increase in the inflation rate to 5.1%. Now, this has sparked lots of concern that the Reserve Bank will now increase interest rates and possibly as early as next week. So during the election campaign. What are the political ramifications of all of this?
It's really hard to know how this will play out. Obviously, people have been feeling this cost of living, inflation pressure for a while, even before these figures. They didn't need the figures to confirm that. But on the one hand, the government can say, well, these are really uncertain economic times because overseas factors have been one element in this rise and we don't know what's going to happen and therefore stay with the team you have. On the other hand, of course, many people will feel pressed and discontented and inclined to vote against the government. So the exact implications and how it all plays out, I think, is still uncertain. There's a lot of pressure on the Reserve Bank, objective pressure and from commentators to act next week. Now, if it puts up interest rates next week, that will be the first time there's been an interest rate rise since the 2007 campaign, the first time that is in an election campaign. And of course in 2007 that was under the Howard government. John Howard lost that election.
Well, that's right. So if this happens, if they do increase the interest rate, will it cost the coalition government?
I think that's a big call, and I think at this stage of the campaign, Caroline, we won't be calling the election anyway because, as many people learned in 2019, that can end in tears. So we'll leave our options open as to the result. But nevertheless, I think that certainly the government would not have wanted this big event in the middle of the campaign, although, of course, people knew that a large inflation figure was coming. They just didn't think it would be quite this large.
Okay, so the next big issue has been national security, following the Security Pact signing between the Solomons and China. Now, national security has traditionally been a really, a strong suit for the coalition. But he's drawn, attracted a lot of criticism that there's a perception that he's really not acted strongly enough in the Pacific region. Do you think that he's been asleep at the wheel?
My feeling is that obviously the government could have had a better and more robust policy in the Pacific. It could have, for example, not cut aid years ago and been more active in that area. On the other hand, I think in terms of the Solomons, we have over the years been very cognizant of their needs and requests. For example, we sent police and some defence personnel just a while ago to help them deal with their security situation, and years ago we were also pretty helpful over a period in relation to that. I also think that probably no government, whether coalition or Labor, could necessarily have headed off this China-Solomons deal. The Chinese have a lot of money, and I think that the Solomons administration was receptive to that. The Chinese also have great determination to get into these countries where possible, and all the diplomacy in the world and even all the foreign aid in the world from Australia or elsewhere wouldn't necessarily have countered that. Now, there are arguments about whether we should have sent the foreign minister rather than the Minister for Pacific Affairs, but I think that in a way, some of those things are at the margin. But this is a very serious situation for Australia. It's a serious situation for the region. You do see the strong reaction of the American government, and I think that the long-term implications are, quite major.
Now, climate change has also come back to centre stage in the sort of the last part of this week in the campaign. There's old divisions in the coalition have reared their head again. Senator Matt Canavan has come out to say that the net zero by 50/50 emissions target is dead, but that's actually not party policy or government policy. Is this damaging for the government's campaign to see these old divisions keep sort of re-emerging?
I think it is damaging for the government. Matt Canavan, of course, never signed up to the 2050 target. You'll remember last year there was all that agonising in the Nationals to get them on board for that before the Glasgow conference, and also because the Prime Minister wanted that target because he was under pressure from moderates in his own party who were facing what have become known as the teal candidates in those city seats. But the National Party was always split. Barnaby Joyce was sort of dragged along by the hair, as it were, to a deal which was very generous in terms of dollars for the Nationals, and we're seeing that rolled out in the campaign. But in the deep north, the National supporters don't really buy 2050 and the targets. So it is, I think, difficult because the effect of this will be in those Liberal seats in the south. What the Teal people have been saying is, all right, you say these Liberals are moderates, they believe in climate change, but they vote with Barnaby Joyce. That's been their exact line. And now they can say, well, you see that the Nationals are divided. Whatever Barnaby says about we'll honour the deal. If the government's re-elected, the Teals will say, then the Nationals could change policy again, pressure Morrison to throw out the 2050 target. You can see the line, whether it is actually right or not, or justified or not, is beside the point. I think it will play quite strongly for the independent candidates in those seats where Barnaby Joyce, let's face it, is a bit of a trigger point.
Okay, and so also there's a new scare campaign emerging from the coalition, another tax scare campaign, but this time about, carbon taxes.
Sneaky
carbon taxes. So is there any truth in this?
Well, this is based on the fact that the Labor Party would use in a robust way the safeguards mechanism that the coalition brought in to, in fact, have a more trenchant climate policy to get down emissions from the big emitters. Now, the Labor spokespeople over the last few days have really muddled their message a bit on how this would actually work in particular for coal mines, but nevertheless it is the coalition's mechanism. But the coalition says, the way it works under us, no one's much affected. The way it would work under Labor, then it would be really have teeth and be nasty for these coal miners. Whether you call this a carbon tax, sneaky or not, I mean, we really do have, in effect, through various policies, a carbon tax, if you like, even now. So that's sort of definitional and rhetoric and propaganda. I don't think the coalition will be able to get this scare campaign going particularly strongly, because I think it's sort of fighting a few elections ago, in this context, using the old lines, and especially as people really are quite exercised about climate these days, and secondly, especially when the coalition's got its own internal fighting.
Okay, so, Labor's had a relatively easy week, it would seem, in comparison to the government. The Labor leader, Anthony Albanese, he's been in isolation. I think he comes out tonight after his, after testing positive for COVID. He's been in isolation. Has that had any kind of negative impact on Labor's campaign?
They've, of course, thrown other front benchers into the fray. Richard Marles, the deputy leader, got into a bit of trouble over his various historical statements about China. He struggled a bit, but others, I think, have performed well. Penny Wong, Jason Clare, who's actually one of the two official spokespeople for the campaign, has looked very impressive in his performances. I don't think that Anthony Albanese being out of the limelight has hurt Labor because primarily the government's been hit with these other issues. But there's still this problem that people do not know yet what they think about Anthony Albanese and whether that will play in when they come to really make decisions at the end of the campaign, I think remains a big question. They need to be at least comfortable that he would be a competent alternative Prime Minister. Otherwise, they're reluctant to jump into the Labor camp.
But the polls are holding steady.
The polls are holding steady, and I think that's very interesting. They're also telling us that people are really turned off both leaders, I think. Morrison's trust is very low. Albanese doesn't do well on economic management. Neither are doing well on competence, according to the polls. But nevertheless, in the two big polls that came out this week, Labor was still in a winning position.
So what's your overall impression of the campaign so far? I mean, it's one of these things that it's a truism in election campaigning that, the thing you have to look out for is the thing coming from left field, the unexpected.
Well, there are lots of things from left field, but I think it's quite a fragmented campaign. The different issues are playing out in different places. I think it's also a seat-by-seat campaign in a number of crucial areas, and that could be going in both directions. I think it's also a pretty sort of low campaign, as it were. We're not up in the stratosphere talking about big ideas for the country. We're throwing insults, we're talking up scares, it's all bits and pieces, and I think that for the general public, they're not engaged. They don't want to be engaged. It's like watching a street brawl
fight, yes,
from the window and thinking, will I close this window and just let them get on with it?
Okay, well, look, thanks, Michelle. I look forward to discussing more of the street fight in the weeks to come.
Thanks, Caroline.